Here on our channel, people's stories come to life. Stories from different eras, professions, and destinies. Each of them follows their own path, their own life woven from circumstances, challenges, and choices. Before we step into their world, make sure to subscribe, and later, share your impressions in the comments. Now, let's begin. Some stories don't start with loud events. They start small, with details, with moments that seem insignificant, yet hold entire worlds within them. These are stories about people who never chose to be heroes. They simply lived, worked, made mistakes, learned from them, and kept moving forward. The lives of such people unfold like a slowly blooming flower, each petal revealing itself in its own time, each layer hiding new secrets, new pains, new joys. This is a story from a time when the world was just a little different. The city of Vienna in the 1870s was a place of noise and contradiction, though a boy of 12 years did not yet possess the language to name such things. Johannes Keller knew only that the streets where he lived smelled of horse manure and coal smoke, that the buildings leaned toward one another as if sharing secrets, and that hunger was a frequent companion, sharper on some mornings than others. His mother had died 2 winters before, a swift illness that took her on a Thursday and was forgotten by the following Monday, absorbed into the relentless machinery of the city's survival. His father, Johann Sr., worked the docks unloading freight from the Danube, a labor that paid little and left his hands permanently darkened by tar and rope. There had been talk in the weeks after the funeral of what would become of the boy. Work, everyone agreed, was the answer. Work was always the answer. The print shop of Herr Schoenfeld occupied a narrow building on the Favoritenstrasse, 3 stories of brick and old wood, with large windows on the ground floor that displayed samples of the master's work, invitations printed on cream-colored paper, business cards arranged in precise grids, a poster advertising a dental surgeon with letters so clean and uniform they seemed almost miraculous in their perfection. Johannes's father had known someone who knew someone employed by the shop, and through this chain of tenuous connection, the apprenticeship had been secured. It would cost the family nothing, which was itself a miracle. The boy would learn a trade. This was presented to him as an opportunity, though in his early memory of that first morning, standing outside the shop window, watching his own reflection ghost over the printed words, he felt only a cold and nameless dread. Herr Schoenfeld was a man of 55 years, with the particular bearing of someone who had invested decades into mastering a precise and demanding craft. His face was lined, his eyes protected behind wire-rimmed spectacles that he removed often to rub and replace. He did not smile when Johannes entered the shop, but nodded once, a gesture that conveyed neither warmth nor rejection, simply acknowledgement. He led the boy through the front room, past the counter where customers placed orders, into the heart of the operation, a space that was simultaneously beautiful and overwhelming. Long wooden tables held trays of metal type arranged in compartments, organized by font and size according to a logic that seemed incomprehensible. Tall iron printing presses stood like patient machines, their surfaces scarred by years of use. The smell was extraordinary, not unpleasant, but strange and all-consuming. Ink, paper, oil, wood, something metallic underneath. The air itself seemed to be made of this smell. "This is the compositor's domain," Herr Schoenfeld said, gesturing toward the tables. "Every letter you see here must be placed by hand, in the correct order, in the correct size. You will learn to read backwards and upside down. You will learn to feel the difference between a capital M and a capital N with your fingers closed. You will be very slow at first, this is expected. You will be slightly faster after several months. After several years, you may become competent. Do you understand?" Johannes nodded, though he understood almost nothing, except that he would be expected to remember things and to work with his hands until they hurt. Herr Schoenfeld showed him the type cases, demonstrating the organization of characters, vowels in the uppercase, commonly used letters positioned for quick access, rare letters relegated to corners. "This is called the California job case," the master said. "German printers consider it inferior. I prefer it. You will learn to prefer it as well, because you will spend your days here, and preference follows from familiarity." The first weeks were characterized by profound frustration. Johannes's hands were too small, his fingers too weak. He would grasp a piece of type, a single metal letter no larger than a pea, with its raised face carrying an image that would later transfer ink onto paper, and it would slip from his grip or tumble into the compositor's composing stick, the metal ruler in which letters were arranged in lines. Other apprentices, including one boy only a few years his senior, moved with a confidence that seemed to belong to a different species. They talked to one another in the abbreviations and shorthand of experienced workers, language he could not quite parse. During the first lunch break, sitting alone with his bread and cheese, Johannes considered simply leaving the shop and never returning. His father would beat him, certainly, but the beating would be brief. The daily humiliation of incompetence seemed a heavier price. What changed was not dramatic, but gradual, the way spring arrives in a city without announcing itself precisely. Within weeks, the strange arrangement of type began to make sense, not intellectually, but bodily. His fingers learned the distance from one compartment to another. His eyes began to anticipate where a particular letter lived. The rhythm of selecting type, placing it in the composing stick, checking the arrangement, moving on. This rhythm became almost musical. One afternoon, perhaps the 7th or 8th week into his apprenticeship, Herr Schoenfeld watched him work for several minutes without interruption. "Your fingers are learning," the master said. It was not quite praise, but it was recognition. That evening, walking home through streets that seemed somehow less hostile, Johannes felt something like pride, thin and fragile, but undeniable. The shop itself became a kind of education beyond the technical mastery of typography. Johannes observed that different customers received different treatment. A wealthy merchant placing an order for business cards was offered a chair and shown samples of particularly fine papers. A woman from the neighborhood, requesting a simple notice about a lost cat, was treated with efficient briskness. The orders themselves were revealing. Wedding announcements, death notices, advertisements for everything from corsets to coal, political posters with words rendered in letters so bold they seemed to shout. He began to understand, dimly at first, that words made visible in type carried a particular authority. Once something was printed, it existed in the world in a way that mere speech did not. It could be repeated, distributed, held in the hand. There was an incident in the 3rd month that crystallized this understanding. A wealthy family had commissioned invitations for a significant social event, the announcement of an engagement. Herr Schoenfeld had personally overseen much of the work, and the result was elegant. Cream-colored paper of high quality, ornamental borders executed in a delicate serif font, the names and details printed in perfect alignment. The job was completed on a Thursday afternoon. Early Friday morning, before the invitations were to be distributed, a man arrived at the shop in visible agitation. This was Herr Keller, a city official of some minor importance. His face was flushed, his manner imperious. One of the invitations had reached him by mistake. He was not among the invited guests, though his name appeared on the list of those attending. This was, he made clear, an intolerable error. Heads would roll, careers would be ended. Herr Schoenfeld, faced with this crisis, remained outwardly calm, though Johannes could see the tension in the set of his shoulders. The invitations would need to be reprinted, the mistake corrected. But which mistake? Upon investigation, it became clear that the error had originated in the information provided by the client, not in the execution of the printing. The family that had commissioned the invitations had, through their own carelessness, provided an incorrect list. The printer was being blamed for a mistake that was not his, yet Herr Schoenfeld did not protest vigorously. He simply accepted that the invitations would be redone, at his own cost and effort. After Herr Keller departed, the master printer stood before the pile of now worthless invitations, each one a perfect object rendered useless by the politics of inclusion and exclusion. "Do you see, Johannes?" Herr Schoenfeld said quietly, not quite looking at the boy. "We are not merely craftsmen. We are also servants. We serve those who have power. They do not always treat us kindly. Sometimes they blame us for their own errors. Sometimes they simply take their business elsewhere when a better opportunity appears. This is the way of the world. A printer must be skilled, yes, but he must also be diplomatic, flexible, willing to swallow his pride. You have hands that can learn to set type. The question is whether you have the temperament to do this work in a world that does not much value it." Johannes did not fully comprehend this speech at the time, but he understood its emotional weight. He understood that Herr Schoenfeld was revealing something true about the world, a truth that involved injustice and the necessity of accepting it. He also sensed, in the way the master allowed him to help remake the invitations, that this was itself a form of instruction. They worked through the afternoon and into the evening, reconstructing the pages, and in the repetition and precision of this labor, Johannes felt something shift in himself. He began to understand that his work, though unobserved and unpraised, mattered. The words he arranged would reach people. They would convey information that shaped decisions. He was small, invisible, the son of a dock worker, but his hands moved the letters that moved the world, however minutely. As the autumn of his first year in the shop arrived, bringing cooler air and the particular smell of Vienna in transition, Johannes had settled into a kind of acceptance of his new life. His hands were tougher now, marked with small cuts and calluses from handling metal type. His fingertips had developed a slight, permanent staining from the ink that could not quite be scrubbed away. He understood the hierarchy of the shop, Herr Schoenfeld at the apex, followed by the senior compositors, then the intermediate apprentices, and finally Johannes and the newest boy, competing quietly for recognition and the promise of advancement. He no longer felt dread upon entering the shop. Instead, he felt something closer to purpose, or at least the beginning of it. The words he arranged would become newspapers and notices and advertisements. They would scatter across Vienna, falling into the hands of readers who would never know that a boy of 12 had participated in bringing them into existence. Yet something else had begun to germinate within him during these first months, something that would remain with him and shape his relationship to the city for decades to come. He had discovered that proximity to printing conferred a kind of power, not obvious or immediate, but present nonetheless. He could read the words before anyone else could. He could see what was being said before it entered the public realm. He could perceive, in the orders that arrived and the content that was shaped into type, the hidden architecture of Vienna's concerns and desires, and he could sense, too, that this knowledge came with a price. People in power wanted their messages delivered cleanly and efficiently. They did not want printers to think too carefully about the content, to question the narratives being propagated, to wonder about the truthfulness of the claims being made. Neutrality was required. This was the unspoken contract. On the evening of his first year's completion, as Johannes walked home through the crowded streets of the Favoritenstrasse, past the coffee shops and the butchers and the small groceries, he felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and quiet satisfaction. Above him, the city's gas lamps were being lit by workers moving along the streets with practiced efficiency, another invisible labor that made Vienna possible. He passed a newspaper seller calling out headlines about political developments in Eastern Europe, about economic conditions, about social movements. The words had been set by hands like his, arranged by men who understood typography, but perhaps not fully grasped the weight of what they were making visible. In the distance, church bells marked the hour. The Danube flowed beyond the city's boundaries, indifferent to human concerns, and Johannes Keller, boy of 12, future compositor and reluctant witness, walked toward home through the gas-lit streets of Vienna, not yet understanding that he was already being shaped by the city's secrets, its power structures, and the terrible knowledge that would come from being able to read what others had not yet learned. The man who entered the beer hall on Saturday evenings was no longer visibly the apprentice boy of 7 years prior, though the transformation had been so gradual that Johannes himself scarcely noticed it accumulating. His hands were permanently darkened now, the ink having penetrated the skin in patterns that no amount of scrubbing could entirely remove. He was 19 years old, tall and lean, from a diet that consisted largely of bread, soup, and whatever protein he could afford on his compositor's wages. His back carried the slight forward curve of someone who spent 10 hours daily bent over a compositor's table, and his eyes had developed the particular focus of a tradesman, able to distinguish minute differences in font size and letter spacing that would escape an untrained observer entirely. He carried himself with a quiet competence, the bearing of someone who possessed genuine skill in a world that did not particularly value it. The beer hall, called the Goldener Adler, occupied a corner room 2 blocks from the print shop where Johannes had remained employed under Herr Schoenfeld's continued guidance. It was not an establishment of refinement. The walls were stained with tobacco smoke and the residue of decades of spilled drinks, the tables scarred with initials carved by previous patrons, the air thick with the mingled smells of beer, human bodies, and boiled sausage. Yet it possessed a particular vitality that Johannes found necessary to his survival in Vienna. Here, among workers and journeymen and occasional students from the university, He could listen to conversations that ranged far beyond the immediate concerns of his daily labor. Men discussed wages and working conditions, certainly, but they also debated questions of philosophy and politics. They spoke of the changing city, the new electric trams that had begun to appear on certain streets, the telegraph wires that now connected Vienna to distant places, the factories being constructed in the outer districts, the sense that the city itself was being rapidly remade according to principles that ordinary working people did not entirely understand, but felt profoundly in their bodies and circumstances. It was at the Goldener Adler that Johannes had first encountered the newspapers seriously, beyond their mechanical existence as objects to be set in type. An older worker named Friedrich, a carpenter with the bearing of someone who had thought carefully about the world and drawn conclusions that satisfied him imperfectly, had a habit of reading the major newspapers aloud and commenting critically on the content. "Here," Friedrich would say, pointing at a particular article with a calloused finger, "they are telling us that the economic conditions are improving for the working class. Yet my wages have not increased in 3 years. My rent consumes half my income. I can purchase meat twice a week if I do not wish to fall behind on other obligations. This is improvement?" Other listeners would nod or raise objections, and conversations would unfold in which Johannes found himself thinking in ways that the print shop did not encourage. He began to understand that newspapers were not neutral vessels of information, but rather instruments of argument, shaped by the interests of those who owned the publications and the advertisers who sustained them financially. During these years, Vienna itself seemed to be accelerating through time, at a pace that produced vertigo in those who attempted to track its transformations. The city was preparing for its role as the capital of an imperial realm, and the physical evidence of this ambition was everywhere. New districts were being developed in concentric rings around the old city center. The Ringstrasse, that grand circular boulevard that had replaced the medieval fortifications, was now lined with massive neo-Gothic and neo-Renaissance structures: the Opera House, the Natural History Museum, the Parliament Building, each one a declaration that Vienna intended to be understood as a great power. Electricity was beginning to appear, first in wealthy districts and public buildings, then spreading gradually outward. The old gas lamps that had illuminated the streets during Johannes's childhood now seemed like relics of a previous era, though they persisted in poorer neighborhoods where the cost of electrification had not yet been deemed economically justifiable. Johannes observed these transformations with the particular intensity of someone who did not quite belong to any single stratum of society. He was too educated, too thoughtful, to be a simple laborer. Yet he lacked the education, connections, and capital to ascend to the merchant or professional classes. He existed in a liminal space, observing the city with the clarity of someone who was simultaneously inside and outside its structures of power. His work as a compositor placed him in proximity to information. He saw advertisements for new developments, read descriptions of luxury goods in the newspapers he helped produce, observed the social hierarchies being articulated in print. Yet this proximity to knowledge was accompanied by a profound lack of purchasing power to participate in the world being described. The print shop where he worked had expanded during these years, reflecting Vienna's explosive growth as a publishing center. Herr Schoenfeld had hired additional compositors, and the operation now occupied 2 buildings instead of 1. Johannes had assumed an informal supervisory role over the newest apprentices, teaching them the craft he had learned through trial and error. This responsibility brought him neither additional wages nor formal advancement, but it offered something he valued, a sense of continuity, the knowledge that he was participating in the transmission of a skill from one generation to the next. Young boys arrived nervous and incompetent, and through patient instruction, delivered in a tone that mimicked Herr Schoenfeld's own blend of severity and hidden care, he transformed them into functional compositors. In these moments, he felt something approaching contentment, a sense that his life, however constrained by economic necessity, contained meaning. It was during these years that Johannes first became aware of Anna, though he would later recognize that she had likely been present at the periphery of his attention for longer than he consciously acknowledged. She was the daughter of Herr Müller, who owned a smaller printing establishment 3 blocks from Schoenfeld's shop. The Müllers were comfortably situated within the petite bourgeoisie, not wealthy by any significant standard, but secure in a way that working people were not. Anna was perhaps 2 or 3 years younger than Johannes, dark-haired and possessed of a thoughtfulness that set her apart from other women he encountered. She sometimes brought food to workers at various print shops, a task assigned to her by her mother as part of maintaining customer relationships and family connections within the printing world. Her appearances at Schoenfeld's shop were irregular but frequent enough to establish a pattern that Johannes's consciousness tracked with the precision normally reserved for important business matters. On one particular Saturday in spring, when the city had emerged from winter with the particular relief that Vienna's residents experienced as ice melted from the Danube and the parks began to open their gates, Anna arrived at the shop with a basket containing fresh bread and several jars of preserved fruit. Herr Schoenfeld had commissioned a substantial job from her father's print shop, an announcement regarding a charitable event organized by one of Vienna's prominent merchant families. The 2 printers were collaborating, dividing the labor according to their respective capacities. Anna was delivering items her mother had sent as a gesture of goodwill. She moved through the shop with a kind of careful respect, acknowledging each worker with a nod, commenting briefly on the quality of the work being produced. When she reached Johannes at his compositor's table, she paused and observed him setting type with what he recognized, through the acute self-consciousness of attraction, was careful attention. "Your hands move very quickly," she said. It was not elaborate praise, but it was genuine observation. "My father says that the best compositors are those who understand that speed and accuracy are not opposing forces, but rather aspects of the same skill. Most people believe you must choose between them. The truly skilled understand that they flow together." Johanna, feeling his face warm in a way he recognized as embarrassment, responded with something that seemed adequate at the moment, but which he replayed in his mind for days afterward, wishing he had articulated his thoughts with greater eloquence. They spoke briefly about the nature of the work, about the particular challenges of the job her father's shop was undertaking, about the weather and the city's transformation. When she departed, she left behind a sense of possibility that seemed to permeate the air around his compositor's table for hours. In the following months, Johanna found himself attending more carefully to the moments when Anna appeared at the shop. These visits were not frequent enough to be entirely predictable, which invested each one with a heightened significance. He arranged his schedule so that he would be occupied with work that allowed him to observe her without appearing to do so. He cultivated conversations that moved beyond simple politeness into something that felt more meaningful, though he remained aware that he might be reading intentions into her words that did not truly exist there. Other workers noticed his distraction and offered the kind of ribald commentary that working men deployed when one of their number demonstrated obvious attraction to a woman. Friedrich, the carpenter-philosopher, offered somewhat different counsel. "Do not allow yourself to become too attached to what you cannot possess," he said one evening at the beer hall. "She is from a different world than ours. Not a cruel world, necessarily, but different. The gap between you and her is not merely a matter of mutual affection, but of material circumstance. Love does not dissolve economic reality." The warning was delivered with kindness, but it struck deep. Johannes understood the truth embedded in Friedrich's words. He earned approximately 30 kreuzer per day, a wage sufficient to maintain himself in modest circumstances, but inadequate to support a wife or establish a household beyond the shared rooms he currently occupied. Anna's father, by contrast, owned property and controlled capital. Any serious relationship between them would require that Johannes accumulate resources sufficient to demonstrate respectability, a process that seemed to stretch indefinitely into the future. Yet knowledge of impossibility did not dissolve the longing it was meant to constrain. Instead, it transformed the longing into something more poignant, a wishing for circumstances to be other than they were, combined with a developing cynicism regarding his ability to reshape those circumstances through his own effort. During these years, Johannes also began to develop a more critical reading practice with regard to the newspapers and publications he helped produce. He would read the same articles twice, once as a compositor, observing the technical execution, and once as a reader, attending to the content and the particular framing of events. He noticed patterns. Certain types of stories received prominent placement and careful language. Descriptions of criminal activity in working-class districts, for instance, tended toward sensationalism and moral judgment. The same kinds of activities conducted by wealthier people received different treatment, often being rendered as regrettable incidents or the results of misunderstanding. Advertisements for luxury goods were frequent, each one proposing a vision of how life could be improved through consumption. Political coverage seemed carefully calibrated to present certain perspectives as reasonable and others as dangerous. He began to understand that his work was not neutral, that by setting type according to the specifications of editors and owners, he was participating in the construction of particular versions of reality. This awareness brought him both intellectual satisfaction and a kind of anxiety. If newspapers were not neutral, then where could one encounter truth? He began to seek out publications with different political orientations, comparing how the same events were described from different perspectives. This practice was illuminating, but also destabilizing. It suggested that truth was fragmented, that it depended significantly on the vantage point from which one was observing, that power shaped not merely which stories were told, but how they were told. He shared these observations with Friedrich and other workers at the beer hall, and these conversations became increasingly important to him. More important, perhaps, than the wages he earned or the modest security his employment provided. The city continued to transform around him. New newspapers appeared with regularity, some lasting only months before disappearing, others establishing themselves as permanent features of Vienna's information landscape. The quantity of print being produced seemed to increase exponentially, as if the city's expansion in physical space was matched by an expansion in the quantity of words being generated to describe, analyze, and justify that expansion. Johannes and his fellow workers moved through this torrent of language with the peculiar double consciousness of those who understood it both technically and intellectually. They understood printing as craft, as the physical manipulation of materials according to learned principles. But they also understood that they were participating in something larger, in the production of the very narratives and frameworks through which Vienna understood itself and its place in the world. By the time Johannes reached his 19th year and had been working as a compositor for 7 years, the initial wonder he had experienced upon entering Herr Schoenfeld's shop had been replaced by something more complex, a satisfaction in mastery, combined with an awareness of constraint, a pride in his skill coupled with recognition that his skill, however genuine and valuable, would not be adequately compensated or socially elevated. He could set type with precision and speed. He understood the aesthetic and technical principles that made printed work effective. He had begun to read the city as a text, understanding its visible transformations as manifestations of economic and political forces that operated largely beyond his direct influence. He possessed genuine knowledge and genuine limitation, and he was beginning to understand that these two facts would shape the contours of his entire life. This recognition brought neither peace nor despair, but rather a kind of resigned clarity, the particular wisdom of those who have begun to see the world as it actually functions, rather than as they might wish it to function. One evening in late autumn, walking home from the Goldener Adler as the electric lights were being activated in the wealthier districts, casting their strange new illumination across the city's streets, Johannes passed the shop windows where Anna's father displayed examples of his printing work. In the gaslight, the displayed items, business cards, letterhead, an elegant announcement for a musical performance, seemed to glow with a kind of significance that ordinary objects did not possess. He paused briefly to observe them, thinking about the hands that had arranged the type, the knowledge that had been applied, the care that had been invested. And he thought about Anna, whom he had not seen in several weeks, and about the gap that Friedrich had identified and that Vienna itself seemed to widen with each passing month. The winter was approaching. The city would become harder, colder, more divided between those with adequate shelter and those without. And Johannes would continue his work, setting type, reading newspapers, listening to workers debate philosophy and economics, moving through Vienna as someone who understood its functioning, but who remained essentially powerless to redirect its trajectories. This acceptance was not happiness, but it was a form of clarity. And clarity, however bitter, was preferable to illusion. Vienna in 1888 was a city sustained by newspapers, as much as by water and bread. They appeared on street corners in stacks, their headlines shouted by vendors whose voices competed with the noise of electric trams and horse-drawn carriages. They accumulated in coffee shops and reading rooms, their pages turned by readers seeking information, distraction, or confirmation of their existing beliefs. They were produced in a dozen printing houses distributed across the city, each one a small factory of language where men bent over compositors' tables, arranged metal type, and fed paper through mechanical presses. Johannes Keller, now 31 years old, had spent 13 years as a compositor for the Wiener Zeitung, one of the city's more established publications. He was reliable, skilled, and largely invisible, the kind of worker who was valued precisely because he performed his labor without drawing attention to himself, without making demands, without requiring the emotional or social resources that more demanding employees consumed. His life had acquired the particular rhythm of someone who had accepted the fundamental structures of his existence and had ceased struggling against them. He rented a small apartment in the 4th District, 2 rooms that barely contained the minimal furniture necessary for living: a bed, a table, several chairs, a shelf for books that he had accumulated through careful purchases at the second-hand market. He earned 40 kreuzer per day now, wages that reflected his experience and skill, but that still constrained him to a narrow range of material possibilities. He could afford adequate food, modest clothing that did not shame him, the occasional beer at the Goldener Adler, and little else. He had abandoned certain youthful ambitions. The possibility of marriage and family now seemed as remote as it had appeared impossible during his 19th year, and had constructed a life that was, if not happy, at least functional and bearable. He attended Mass irregularly at the Karmeliterkirche, not from deep conviction, but from a sense that participation in collective ritual provided some form of ballast against the city's relentless transformations. The newspaper office where he worked had been modernized over the years, though modernization was a process that moved haltingly and incompletely. New presses had been installed that could produce pages more rapidly than their predecessors, though the fundamental process remained labor-intensive and dependent on skilled workers like Johannes. The building itself occupied a substantial corner on the Fleischmarkt, and the offices above the printing floor, where editors and administrators worked, seemed to constitute a different world, one of carpets and electric lighting, and conversations conducted in tones of authority that assumed they would be obeyed. The printing floor, by contrast, remains largely as it had always been: humid from the moisture required by the paper, hot from the friction of the presses, perpetually filled with the smell of ink and machine oil. It was a space where skill and strength combined, where the pace of work was determined by external forces, deadlines, the availability of copy, the mechanical rhythms of the equipment, rather than by the preferences of the workers themselves. It was in this space, in the autumn of 1888, that Johannes first became aware of Greta Wallner with any real attention. She was a typesetter, approximately 20 years of age, with the particular carriage of someone who had been raised in circumstances of modest security, but who carried some internal knowledge of loss or disappointment. There were perhaps a dozen women employed in various capacities at the newspaper office, though their work was separated from that of the male compositors through a combination of formal policy and informal custom. The women worked in a designated section, setting type for certain categories of advertisement and certain subsidiary content. They were paid less than male workers, performing substantially identical labor, a disparity that was justified through explanations regarding their supposedly temporary employment and supplementary role in family economics. Greta was quiet, efficient, and seemed to possess a reflectiveness that set her apart from the other female workers, who tended toward either resignation or a kind of aggressive cheerfulness. Johannes had noticed her first because of a small incident involving a typographical error in an advertisement. The error, a transposed letter in a merchant's name, was minor, but visible enough to potentially damage the newspaper's reputation for accuracy. Upon investigation, it was determined that Greta had made the error during her setting of the text. Herr Richter, the newspaper's editor and proprietor, summoned her to his office with a gravity that seemed disproportionate to the minor mistake. Johannes, working nearby, could not hear the conversation, but observed Greta's face when she emerged. It was composed, but marked by a tightness around the eyes that suggested the encounter had been unpleasant. He felt, in that moment, a kind of sympathetic recognition. He understood the particular humiliation of being corrected by someone in authority, the way such corrections could shake one's confidence even when the mistake was genuinely minor. In the weeks following this incident, Johannes found himself attending to Greta's presence in the newspaper office with an attention that surprised him. He told himself that this observation was merely the natural response to someone who had been made visible through an embarrassing incident, that his particular sensitivity to her emotional state reflected his own experience of the workplace's hierarchies and vulnerabilities. Yet as the autumn progressed, he recognized that something more than detached sympathy was occurring. Greta moved through the office with a kind of careful grace, as if she was perpetually conscious of taking up space that might not legitimately belong to her. She spoke rarely, and when she did, it was with precision and a kind of formal politeness that suggested she was not entirely at ease with the people surrounding her. She brought her lunch in a small cloth bag and ate alone, reading while she consumed her bread and cheese. She seemed to possess an interior life that was considerably richer than the circumstances of her employment would ordinarily suggest. Through careful conversations with other workers, Johannes learned fragments of her history. Her parents had died, both of them, within a year of each other, several years previously. She had no siblings and no other close family connections in Vienna. She lived with an aunt who had provided her with shelter, but who was not particularly warm or actively interested in her well-being. Greta's employment at the newspaper was necessary for her survival. The wages she earned, though inadequate for total independence, were essential to maintaining the household she shared with her aunt. She had educated herself beyond the formal schooling available to girls of her social class, through the determined accumulation of books acquired at second-hand prices and borrowed from the city's lending libraries. One worker mentioned having seen her in the Volksgarten on a Sunday afternoon, reading beneath a tree, apparently oblivious to the pedestrian traffic flowing around her. Johannes recognized in these details something that resonated with his own experience, the particular consciousness of someone who was attempting to construct a meaningful inner life within the constraints of economic necessity and limited social position. The recognition itself seemed to dissolve some of the distance he had maintained between himself and others. He began, tentatively, to acknowledge Greta when their paths crossed in the office. At first, these acknowledgments were merely nods of greeting. Gradually, they evolved into brief conversations, remarks about the weather, comments about the difficulty of particular compositional tasks, observations about the quality of paper being used for a particular job. Greta's responses were initially polite but guarded. Over time, they acquired a slightly warmer tone, as if she was recognizing that Johannes's approach to her was different from that of other male workers, less presumptuous, and more genuinely interested in her as a person, rather than as an object of curiosity or potential conquest. By November, they had developed a tentative friendship that was conducted almost entirely through glances and brief conversations in the spaces between their work. They had never spoken outside the newspaper office. They had never been alone together in any meaningful sense. Yet there existed between them an understanding that seemed to transcend these practical limitations. Johannes became aware of Greta's moods when she was worried about something, when she had received disappointing news, when her aunt had apparently been particularly difficult. He learned, through these unspoken communications, that she harbored intellectual interests that extended far beyond her immediate circumstances, that she possessed a kind of moral seriousness regarding the world that contrasted sharply with the cynicism many workers deployed as a defense against the world's indifference. It was during these weeks that Johannes began to reconsider his earlier acceptance of the limits placed upon him by Vienna's social and economic hierarchies. Watching Greta move through the newspaper office, he became aware of the particular injustice of circumstances that constrained intelligent, capable people to labor that was beneath their actual abilities and worth. He began to attend the Goldener Adler with increased frequency, seeking out conversations with Friedrich and other workers who possessed what he recognized as genuine intellectual capacity, constrained by lack of formal credentials and lack of capital. These conversations, which had always possessed a kind of abstract quality, suddenly seemed directly relevant to the tangible lives being lived around him. In late November, a change occurred that would alter the trajectory of his remaining years. Greta did not arrive at the newspaper office one morning. Her absence was notable, but not immediately alarming. Workers occasionally missed days due to illness or family obligations. But the day passed, and then another. And then a week had transpired without any explanation or communication from her. Her workstation remained empty, her compositor's tools undisturbed. Herr Richter made inquiries and reported that Greta had apparently vacated her aunt's house, leaving behind no indication of her destination or intentions. The assumption, conveyed through the casual gossip that circulated in the office, was that she had likely run away to pursue some romantic entanglement, or had perhaps emigrated to another city in search of better opportunities. The editor seemed mildly annoyed at the inconvenience of replacing her. Her fellow workers expressed a kind of sympathetic resignation regarding the precariousness of women's circumstances. But Johannes could not accept this narrative of simple disappearance. The Greta he knew, whatever limited knowledge he possessed, seemed incapable of abandoning her position without explanation or communication. She had never expressed any romantic attachments. She had never spoken of leaving Vienna or seeking employment elsewhere. She had seemed, if anything, committed to maintaining the fragile stability she had constructed for herself. The absence of explanation troubled him in a way that he could not entirely articulate. It suggested that something had occurred that disrupted her life sufficiently to cause her to abandon everything: her employment, her residence, her connections to the city. This disruption implied some kind of crisis, some kind of event or discovery or pressure that had forced her to choose flight over remaining. In the days following Greta's disappearance, Johannes found himself unable to concentrate on his work with his usual precision. His hands moved through the familiar motions, selecting type, placing it in the composing stick, adjusting spacing, checking alignment, but his mind was elsewhere, engaged with questions that had no obvious answers. He began to move through Vienna differently, observing the street with a particular attention, as if Greta might appear around any corner. He He walked past the building where her aunt lived, observing it from across the street, seeking some indication of what had transpired. He found himself in the neighborhoods where she was likely to have spent time, the locations of the city's libraries, the parks where he had heard she sometimes went to read. None of these activities produced any concrete information, yet they altered his consciousness of the city itself. Vienna, which he had known as a space of work and habitual movement, became a landscape of mystery, a place where people could vanish, where ordinary lives could be interrupted by events that left no visible traces. It was this altered consciousness, this nascent awareness that the city contained dimensions of experience beyond what was visible on its surface, that would eventually propel him into a kind of investigation that he could not have anticipated, and that would gradually consume a significant portion of his emotional and intellectual energy. For now, in November of 1888, the disappearance of a young woman of no particular social importance seemed like a private mystery, a personal puzzle that concerned him, but that appeared to concern no one else. The newspaper continued to be produced, the pages turned out with the reliable precision that readers expected. The city continued its transformations, and Johannes Keller, compositor and witness, began the long process of learning that proximity to unexplained absence could itself become a kind of presence, a weight that would require years to fully comprehend. The police station on the Grosse Pfarrgasse was a building designed to communicate authority through its physical presence. 4 stories of stone and iron, with narrow windows that suggested both fortress and prison. Johannes had never entered such a building before, and the experience of crossing its threshold produced a particular anxiety that had nothing to do with rational assessment of danger, and everything to do with the deep conditioning of a working man in a hierarchical society. Police were not allies. They existed to maintain order, which meant they existed to constrain the activities of people like himself. Yet he had been summoned, a brief message delivered through a boy at the newspaper office, to appear for questioning regarding Greta Wallner's disappearance. The tone of the summons suggested this was not optional. Inspector Steinhauer occupied a small office on the 2nd floor, a space that was remarkably spare in its furnishings: a desk, several chairs, a filing cabinet, a single window overlooking the street below. The inspector himself was a man in his mid-40s, with the particular bearing of someone who had inhabited positions of authority long enough to believe that authority was a natural expression of his personality, rather than a function conferred by institutional position. He was not unpleasant. His manner was businesslike rather than overtly hostile, but there was present in his demeanor an assumption of superiority that seemed to pervade the very air around him. He gestured for Johannes to sit, and then proceeded to ask questions in a tone that suggested he was already familiar with the answers and was primarily interested in observing whether Johannes would lie. "You were acquainted with the missing woman, Fräulein Wallner?" Steinhauer began, his pen poised above a notebook. "I knew her from the newspaper office," Johannes replied carefully. "We worked in proximity to one another." "I would not characterize us as friends, precisely, but we were familiar with each other." "You spoke with her regularly?" "Occasionally. Brief conversations about work, about the weather, ordinary exchanges between colleagues." The inspector made a notation in his book, a gesture that seemed designed to communicate that he was recording information that might later prove relevant to some determination Johannes could not yet anticipate. Did she ever confide in you regarding her personal circumstances, her living situation, her family relationships, her aspirations? Johannes felt his throat tighten. The question seemed innocent, but carried implications he understood dimly. Admitting to intimate knowledge would suggest a closer relationship than was appropriate or wise. Denying such knowledge would be transparently false, given that the inspector had apparently already determined that some form of relationship existed. He navigated between these poles with a kind of careful neutrality.
She mentioned her living situation with her aunt. I understood that her family circumstances were difficult. Beyond these general facts, she was not particularly forthcoming, and I did not press for details. Did she ever mention a romantic attachment, a young man she was seeing? No, she gave no indication of such involvement. You seem to have observed her quite carefully. For someone with whom you merely exchanged occasional pleasantries. The observation hung in the air, like smoke. Johannes recognized the trap inherent in the statement. Any response would either confirm that he had observed her carefully, suggesting a level of interest that might itself appear suspicious, or deny the observation, suggesting either dishonesty or a level of obtuseness that seemed difficult to credit. He chose what seemed like the safest course. I notice things. It is the nature of my work. When one spends hours arranging small objects with precision, one develops habits of observation. These habits do not cease when one leaves the compositor's table. Steinhauer accepted this explanation with a slight nod, though whether he believed it or merely found it an adequate enough response to allow him to proceed was unclear. He asked several more questions regarding Greta's habits, her routines, the people she was known to interact with. Johannes answered as truthfully as he could, while revealing as little as possible. The interview lasted perhaps 20 minutes, at the end of which the inspector indicated that Johannes was free to leave, though he should make himself available for further questioning if necessary. As Johannes descended the stairs and exited the police station, he was aware of a particular tremor in his hands, a physical manifestation of the anxiety that contact with authority had generated. Over the following weeks, Johannes learned fragments of what had become of Greta through conversations with other newspaper workers, through overhead remarks by office staff, through the particular channels through which information circulated in the city. Her aunt had apparently offered no explanation for her niece's departure, merely confirming that Greta was no longer residing in her house. No communication from Greta had been received. No letters, no messages, no indication of where she had gone. The police had made preliminary inquiries and apparently concluded that the matter was not particularly pressing. A young woman of working-class origins disappearing from Vienna was not an event that demanded significant institutional resources, particularly when there was no evidence of foul play. The assumption, perpetuated by those in positions of authority, was that Greta had chosen to leave, that her disappearance was voluntary. Yet something in this narrative troubled Johannes deeply. He began, tentatively, to make inquiries of his own. He visited Greta's workstation and observed that her personal items, a small comb, a handkerchief, a button that had apparently come loose from one of her garments, were undisturbed. He managed to speak briefly with Greta's aunt, approaching her outside a market, and received in response a tense denial of any knowledge beyond confirmation of Greta's absence. The aunt seemed frightened, though of what, Johannes could not immediately determine. He borrowed from the newspaper's archives earlier editions of the publication, reviewing the advertisements and content that Greta would have been setting during the weeks preceding her disappearance, seeking some indication of what might have disturbed her sufficiently to cause her to abandon everything. In one of these archived editions, approximately 3 weeks before Greta's disappearance, Johannes noticed something that seemed potentially significant.
An announcement had appeared regarding the appointment of a new administrator to a city department, a man named Herr Dr. Friedrich Krauss, who had been elevated to a position overseeing urban planning initiatives. The announcement was brief and congratulatory in tone, but something about it seemed to trigger a memory of a conversation he had overheard weeks previously. Greta, speaking quietly to one of the other female workers, had mentioned a man named Krauss with what seemed to be fear in her voice. The conversation had been too brief for him to catch the context, and he had not asked Greta about it subsequently, respecting what seemed to be her privacy regarding the matter. Johannes began to undertake a careful examination of the city's social and institutional landscape, seeking to understand who Krauss was and what role he might have played in Greta's life.
This investigation proved difficult because it required him to move outside his normal channels of information and to ask questions of people who had no particular reason to assist him. Yet through persistence and a kind of careful networking, he developed a picture. Krauss was an official of moderate importance with connections to the city administration and to wealthy merchant families. He was married, respectable in appearance, positioned within the bureaucratic hierarchy in a way that gave him access to various forms of power. There was no obvious connection between Krauss and Greta, yet Johannes's instinct, developed through years of observing how information circulated through Vienna, suggested that a connection existed. His investigation was interrupted by a direct intervention from Herr Richter, the newspaper's editor. Richter summoned him to his office one afternoon, and in a tone that seemed to combine warning with opportunity, informed him that rumors were circulating regarding Johannes's questions about the missing woman. These questions, Richter suggested, demonstrated a kind of misplaced concern that could potentially damage his standing at the newspaper. However, Richter continued, there might be something in Greta's disappearance that could serve as the basis for an investigative article. The newspaper was seeking fresh material that would interest readers and attract attention from rival publications. If Johannes were to undertake a more systematic investigation, not as a private concern, but as a journalistic initiative, it might prove beneficial to all involved. The article could advance both truth and the newspaper's commercial interests. Johannes understood with a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation that he was being offered both a threat and an opportunity. Richter was making clear that his independent inquiry was being observed and noted. Simultaneously, he was offering a mechanism through which that inquiry could be channeled in a direction that benefited the newspaper. The implicit message was that Johannes should cease his private investigation and instead undertake his work under the newspaper's direction and authority. This would provide him with legitimacy and access that private inquiry could not provide. It would also, of course, place the investigation under the newspaper's control, subject to editorial decisions about what could and could not be published. Johannes declined the offer with a courtesy that seemed to surprise Richter. He explained that he had no ambitions as a journalist, that his questions regarding Greta were motivated by personal concern rather than by professional interest, and that he wished to maintain a clear separation between his work as a compositor and any other activities he might undertake. Richter accepted this refusal with a slight smile, that suggested he found Johannes's scruples either admirable or naive. The interview concluded, and Johannes returned to his compositor's table, aware that his actions were now being more carefully observed than previously. The warning seemed to have its intended effect. Johannes ceased his active investigation, recognizing that further pursuit of the matter would likely result in consequences that extended beyond mere observation. He continued to attend the Goldener Adler on Saturday evenings, and he did not entirely abandon his interest in the matter of Greta's disappearance, but he became more circumspect in his inquiries. Yet this enforced caution did not prevent him from continuing to process and integrate information that came to him through ordinary channels. He learned, through a constable who occasionally visited the beer hall and who shared information freely after consuming several beers, that police records had been systematically altered regarding Greta's disappearance. Reports had been filed and then apparently removed from the filing system. The constable seemed uncertain whether this removal was accidental or intentional, but the fact of it itself suggested that someone in authority had an interest in the matter not becoming widely known. Approximately 4 months after Greta's disappearance, Johannes experienced a confrontation with the police that transformed his understanding of the situation and of his own position within Vienna's institutional landscape. He was detained without explanation while walking home from the newspaper office one evening. A constable approached him, identified himself, and indicated that Johannes was being taken to the police station for questioning. He was not arrested formally, nor was he charged with any offense, but he was transported to the same building where he had previously met with Inspector Steinhauer. This time, however, he was held in a basement cell, a cramped space, barely large enough to contain a bench and a small window positioned at street level, for approximately 6 hours before being released with only a vague explanation that his detention had been a misunderstanding. During this period of confinement, Johannes experienced a particular terror that seemed disproportionate to the objective circumstances of his situation. He had committed no crime, and he had been treated with no overt brutality. Yet the experience of being held by the police, of being subject to their authority, without any clear mechanism of appeal or explanation, produced in him a visceral awareness of powerlessness. He understood, in a way that abstract knowledge could never have conveyed, that individuals like himself were fundamentally vulnerable to institutional authority, that the protections nominally provided by law were contingent on factors he did not control and could not reliably predict. When he was released, he was told not to discuss the detention and was warned, in terms that were cordial but firm, that further inquiry regarding Fräulein Wallner might result in more serious consequences. This warning solidified what had previously been an abstract understanding into concrete determination. Johannes ceased his investigation entirely. He returned to his compositor's table and his evening conversations at the beer hall, and he did not speak of Greta or of his detention to anyone. Yet the knowledge of what had occurred, the knowledge that powerful people had an interest in obscuring her disappearance, the knowledge that the police could be deployed to discourage inquiry, the knowledge that truth itself was contingent on power, remained embedded in his consciousness like a stone that could not be dislodged. He had discovered that Vienna contained depths beneath its visible surface, that the city was organized in ways that permitted the erasure of certain people and certain events, that questions asked in the wrong way or at the wrong time could result in consequences that extended beyond mere social awkwardness. This discovery transformed him in ways that were not immediately apparent to others, but that would gradually reshape the entire landscape of his remaining years. 2 years had elapsed since Greta's disappearance, and Vienna had continued its transformation with the relentless momentum of a city convinced of its own importance and destiny. New districts had been annexed. The electric tramway system had expanded, its wires creating a geometrical net across the sky. Buildings had been demolished and rebuilt according to aesthetic principles that favored grandeur over intimacy. The population had swelled, drawing workers from across the empire, creating a city that was simultaneously more prosperous and more divided, more modern and more anxious about its modernity. Yet these external changes seemed to Johannes to occur in a different register than the internal landscape he inhabited. The city he navigated daily, the streets between his apartment and the newspaper office, the Goldener Adler where he spent his Saturday evenings, the small chapel where he occasionally sought refuge, remained largely unchanged, as if certain areas of Vienna existed in a kind of temporal pocket, resistant to the transformations occurring elsewhere. Johannes himself was now 34 years old, an age at which a working man could reasonably be considered settled in his trajectory. He remained employed as a compositor at the Wiener Zeitung, his wages unchanged, his prospects for advancement non-existent. He had acquired no wife, fathered no children, accumulated no significant property. His apartment continued to contain the same sparse furnishings he had assembled during his 20s. His daily routine remained unaltered: work, home, occasional meals at a neighborhood establishment, the beer hall on Saturday nights, Mass on certain religious holidays more from habit than conviction. To any external observer, his life would have appeared entirely stable, almost static in its lack of variation. Yet, beneath this surface stability, a significant transformation had been occurring, one that would have been invisible to anyone who did not know where to look. The transformation was fundamentally internal, a matter of consciousness rather than circumstance. Johannes had become, over the 2 years since Greta's disappearance, increasingly preoccupied with questions regarding the nature of truth, the relationship between power and knowledge, and the meaning of a life lived within the constraints of institutional authority. He had not forgotten the matter of Greta. It would be more accurate to say that he had learned to carry the memory with him as a permanent passenger, present even in moments of apparent distraction. But he had ceased to pursue active investigation. He had learned, through the language of his detention and the subsequent warnings delivered by police officers, that certain questions could not be asked without incurring consequences that extended beyond mere discomfort. This learning had produced in him a peculiar doubling of consciousness. He maintained an external presentation of normalcy, while internally occupied with the weight of knowledge that could not be acted upon. At the newspaper office, he continued to perform his work with the precision and skill that had become habitual. His hands arranged type with practiced efficiency. His eyes caught errors that others overlooked. His understanding of the technical and aesthetic aspects of printing remained undiminished. Yet his consciousness of what he was doing had fundamentally altered. He was no longer simply a craftsman applying skill to the production of newspapers. He was increasingly aware of himself as a participant in the construction of narratives that shaped how Vienna understood itself. The articles he helped set into type were not neutral descriptions of reality, but rather selections from reality, interpretations that emphasized certain facts while obscuring others.
The advertisements he arranged were representations of desire, proposals regarding how life should be lived, implicit arguments about social hierarchy and the proper distribution of resources. This heightened consciousness of the newspaper's role in shaping public understanding extended naturally into a more critical reading practice. Johannes began to examine the newspapers he helped produce with a kind of suspicious attention that his earlier experience had not invited. He noticed patterns. Certain types of stories received prominent placement, while others were relegated to back pages or omitted entirely. Crime in working-class districts was reported in sensationalistic language that emphasized the depravity and irrationality of the perpetrators. Similar crimes in wealthier neighborhoods were presented as regrettable aberrations, misunderstandings, or results of temporary emotional disturbance. The activities of government officials were described in terms that presumed their fundamental competence and good intentions. The activities of workers who organized or protested were described in language that suggested irrationality and dangerous radicalism. He began to notice, too, the systematic absence of certain stories, events that seemed significant, but which never appeared in print. There were patterns of police activity that suggested investigations into matters that were never publicly reported. There were fires, accidents, and deaths that occurred with notable frequency but which received minimal coverage, as if acknowledging them too prominently might suggest that the city was less orderly and less secure than the newspapers generally proposed. This absence itself became a kind of presence in Johannes's mind. He became aware of the stories that were not being told, the narratives that were being suppressed, the reality that existed in the gaps between what the newspapers described and what actually occurred on Vienna's streets. This consciousness found expression in his conversations at the Goldener Adler, though he was careful to frame his observations as intellectual rather than personal. Friedrich, the carpenter philosopher who had warned him years earlier about the impossibility of his attachment to Anna, had remained a regular presence at the beer hall. Their conversations had evolved over the years, from the somewhat naive discussions of his youth into something more sophisticated and more troubling. Friedrich, it emerged, had himself experienced various forms of institutional repression. He had been involved in labor organizing and had spent time in police custody for his activities. He had learned, through direct experience, how power operated in Vienna, how it constrained certain forms of expression while permitting others, how it created zones of visibility and invisibility, speech and silence. "The newspapers are like a fever dream," Friedrich said one evening, gesturing with his beer glass in a manner that suggested he had consumed several drinks. "They show us a Vienna that does not quite exist, a Vienna that is orderly, that is progressing toward improvement, that is governed by rational principles and administered by competent people. But if you walk the streets with open eyes, you see another Vienna, one that is chaotic, that is extracting terrible costs from ordinary people, that is governed by interests rather than by principles." The newspapers exist to reconcile these two Viennas, to convince people that the orderly Vienna is real, and the other one is merely an illusion, a temporary problem that will be solved through the proper administration of existing institutions. Johannes listened to such pronouncements with the particular attention of someone who had begun to suspect that there was truth embedded in what might otherwise be dismissed as cynical ranting. He had in fact begun to develop a theory, inchoate and difficult to articulate, but present nonetheless,
regarding the relationship between his detention by the police and Greta's disappearance. The detention had seemed arbitrary, yet it had occurred in a context where he had been asking questions about a disappearance that had apparently been deemed not worth investigating officially. The message seemed clear. There were matters that were not to be investigated, truths that were not to be pursued, narratives that were not to be questioned.
The police, in detaining him, had been communicating something about the boundaries of permissible inquiry. He began during these 2 years to visit the city's libraries with increased frequency. This practice was not new. He had always read, acquiring books through second-hand purchases and borrowing from lending libraries. But the focus of his reading altered significantly. He began to seek out texts that addressed questions of social organization, of political philosophy, of history. He read Schopenhauer's pessimistic philosophy and found in it a certain comfort, the idea that suffering was fundamental to existence and that happiness was merely the temporary absence of suffering seemed to align with his experience. He read accounts of historical events, attempting to understand how official narratives of history were constructed and maintained. He acquired a work of journalism that described, in careful detail, various forms of police corruption and institutional injustice across European cities, and found in its pages descriptions of mechanisms that seemed directly applicable to what he had witnessed in Vienna. This intellectual labor was not without its costs. As his consciousness of the world's injustices and the mechanisms through which those injustices were maintained became more acute, he found his capacity for simple contentment diminished. The beer hall conversations, which had once provided satisfaction through the exchange of ideas, began to feel repetitive and ultimately futile. Everyone seemed to understand at some level that the system was corrupt, that power was distributed unjustly, that institutions served their own interests rather than the public good. Yet this understanding translated into no concrete action, no organized response, no meaningful attempt to alter the fundamental structures of authority. Instead, it manifested in resigned commentary and occasional expressions of angry frustration that were contained within the walls of the beer hall, and that evaporated the following morning. Johannes found himself increasingly drawn to the small chapel near his apartment, the Karmeliterkirche, where he had occasionally attended Mass during his earlier years. He began to visit with greater frequency, particularly in the late afternoons, when few other people were present. He did not attend the services themselves, but rather sat in the empty chapel, observing the play of light through the stained glass windows, the arrangement of votive candles flickering in their small glass holders, the spatial organization of the space that directed attention toward the altar and the transcendent principles it represented. It was here that he encountered the priest, Father Matthias, an older man of perhaps 60 years, whose own face carried the marks of having thought carefully about difficult questions and having reached conclusions that were not entirely comforting. Their first conversation occurred when Father Matthias discovered Johannes sitting alone in the chapel on an afternoon when no services were occurring. Rather than expressing disapproval, the priest sat nearby, and they sat in silence for several minutes before the priest began to speak. "You carry something heavy," Father Matthias observed. It was not a question, and Johannes did not feel compelled to deny the observation. They began a tentative conversation in which Johannes, speaking carefully
and omitting certain identifying details, described his preoccupation with a disappearance that had been rendered invisible through institutional indifference, and his growing awareness of how institutions functioned to suppress certain truths while promoting others. Father Matthias listened with the particular attention of someone who had heard many confessions and who understood human suffering in its various manifestations. When Johannes finished speaking, the priest did not offer conventional religious consolations. Instead, he offered something closer to recognition. "I have also seen things," Father Matthias said, "that I could not adequately address through the mechanisms available to me. I have encountered injustice. I have recognized that the Church of which I am a servant sometimes functions to protect power rather than to challenge it. I made certain choices about how to respond to these recognitions. I chose to continue in my position while maintaining what integrity I could preserve. This is not a heroic choice. It is a choice that accommodates itself to the world as it exists, rather than attempting to transform it. But it is perhaps better than the alternative of complete despair." These conversations with Father Matthias provided Johannes with a kind of companionship in his internal struggles, though they did not resolve them. He came to understand that his preoccupation with Greta's disappearance and its aftermath was not merely a private concern, but rather a manifestation of a larger philosophical crisis regarding the possibility of living meaningfully within unjust systems. He did not arrive at definitive answers to this crisis, but he developed what might be characterized as a working philosophy. The understanding that one could simultaneously recognize the fundamental injustice of existing arrangements while accepting one's inability to fundamentally alter those arrangements. This philosophy emphasized the importance of small acts of integrity, of maintaining honesty regarding the world's actual functioning, rather than the comforting narratives that most people deployed, of finding meaning in the quality of one's work and one's relationships, rather than in grand achievements or transformative social projects. By the end of the second year after Greta's disappearance, Johannes had achieved a kind of equilibrium that was not happiness, but that was bearable. His work as a compositor continued. His apartment remained sparse and orderly. His social connections remained limited, though his conversations at the Goldener Adler had developed an additional layer of intimacy with Friedrich and one or two others who seemed to inhabit similar intellectual terrain. He carried the knowledge of Greta's disappearance and what it seemed to represent about Vienna's functioning as a permanent weight. Not a weight that incapacitated him, but one that had become integrated into the fundamental structure of how he moved through the world. He had learned that some truths could not be acted upon, that some knowledge could only be born, that some losses could only be acknowledged privately and silently. This learning, though painful, seemed to him preferable to the alternative of willful ignorance or the exhaustion of constant, futile struggle against overwhelming institutional power. Vienna, in the spring of 1894, possessed a quality of restlessness that manifested in various registers throughout the city's social and political landscape. The economic conditions that had seemed promising during the earlier part of the decade had begun to deteriorate. There had been strikes among certain categories of workers, and the police response had been swift and severe. The newspapers, including the Wiener Zeitung, where Johannes continued his labor, reported these events with language that suggested the strikers were engaged in dangerous radicalism that threatened the city's stability and prosperity. Yet beneath this official narrative, Johannes perceived, through his work and through the conversations he maintained with Friedrich and others, a different reality. Workers were responding to genuine deterioration in their circumstances, to wages that had become inadequate relative to the rising cost of living, to working conditions that seemed to grow progressively more onerous. The official narrative of danger and radicalism was itself a form of suppression, a mechanism through which legitimate grievances were being delegitimized and criminalized. Johannes himself, now 36 years old, had begun to experience the particular anxiety that accompanied approaching middle age, without having achieved any of the material security or social standing that middle age traditionally conferred. His wages, unchanged for 6 years, were now genuinely insufficient to maintain his apartment and to purchase adequate food and clothing. He had begun to experience periods of genuine hunger, something he had thought he had escaped in his teenage years. His apartment, which had once seemed adequate, now felt increasingly cramped and depressing. More troubling than these practical concerns, however, was a sense that his life had solidified into a pattern that would remain essentially unchanged for the remainder of his years. He would work as a compositor until his hands became too damaged or his vision too impaired to continue. He would age in his small apartment. He would die, and his death would be noticed by few people and would alter nothing in the functioning of Vienna. It was in this context of accumulated dissatisfaction and quiet desperation that Johannes was approached one afternoon as he left the newspaper office by a young man who introduced himself as Herr Wilhelm Steiger, a journalist of approximately 24 years of age. Steiger was not particularly tall or physically imposing, but he carried himself with a kind of earnest determination that suggested he had committed himself to purposes that seemed important to him. He asked if they might speak privately, and Johannes, experiencing both caution and a kind of curiosity regarding what this encounter might portend, agreed to walk with the young man toward a nearby cafe. Once seated in a quiet corner, Steiger explained that he had been conducting research regarding missing women in Vienna, a pattern that seemed to him to suggest something systematic rather than random individual disappearances. He had somehow become aware that Johannes had, years previously, asked questions about a particular disappearance, that of Greta Wallner. Steiger's research had led him to similar cases, and he believed that there might be a story worth investigating and eventually publishing. He was seeking sources who could provide information or perspective on these disappearances. Had Johannes, Steiger asked, encountered other such cases during his time at the newspaper? Did he believe that the disappearances represented a genuine pattern or merely a matter of coincidence? Johannes's initial response was caution, bordering on fear. His detention by the police, which had occurred years earlier, and which he had never directly discussed with anyone, remained a vivid memory of institutional power, deployed to discourage inquiry. He was acutely aware that involvement with this journalist could potentially result in similar or worse consequences. Yet, he was also aware of something else, a weariness regarding his own silence, a sense that maintaining his protective caution had come at the cost of his ability to participate in anything resembling meaningful action. He engaged with Steiger cautiously, neither confirming nor denying his previous interest in Greta's disappearance, but rather asking the young journalist what he had discovered through his own research and what his intentions were regarding any story he might produce. Steiger proved to be more sophisticated in his approach than Johannes had initially assessed. The young man was not naive, but rather possessed of a kind of idealistic determination that seemed to acknowledge the dangers inherent in the investigation while choosing to proceed despite them. He had discovered through careful work in police records and through interviews with families of missing women that there did appear to be a pattern. Approximately 7 women, all of working-class origins, all approximately in their late teens or early 20s, had disappeared over the past 6 years. The official police explanations varied. Some had supposedly run away to pursue romantic attachments. Others had allegedly emigrated to other cities. One had been presumed dead by suicide. Yet the families of these women, when they could be located and convinced to speak, reported that the disappearances seemed uncharacteristic, that the women had given no indication of leaving Vienna, that official investigations had been perfunctory and seemingly designed to discourage further inquiry. As Steiger spoke, Johannes felt his own suppressed knowledge beginning to press against the constraints he had maintained around it. He had, over the 6 years since Greta's disappearance, observed certain patterns that seemed potentially relevant. He had noticed references in newspapers to the activities of various city officials, including Herr Dr. Friedrich Krauss, whose appointment he had noted in the weeks preceding Greta's disappearance. Krauss had seemed to rise in administrative importance, acquiring responsibilities that granted him access to various aspects of city governance. There had been, in the newspapers, occasional references to investigations into his conduct, but these references had been vague and had apparently been suppressed before they developed into significant scandals. There had also been, in private conversations at the beer hall and through the networks of workers' gossip, occasional suggestions that Krauss had been involved in relationships with young women of working-class origins, relationships that seemed to be conducted with a kind of exploitative disregard for the women's actual wishes or circumstances. After a considerable period of conversation, during which Johannes found himself gradually revealing more than he had thought he would, an understanding began to emerge between him and Steiger. The journalist was genuinely committed to investigating the pattern and potentially publishing a story, though he was aware of the dangers inherent in such a project. Johannes, for his part, recognized that he faced a choice. He could continue to maintain his protective silence, preserving his own safety at the cost of permitting the pattern to continue unexamined and uncontested. Or he could provide information and perspective to Steiger, accepting the risks that such participation would entail. The choice, framed in this way, seemed less genuinely free than it might have appeared. Johannes found himself unable to maintain his silence any longer. The weight of the knowledge he carried had become too substantial to be borne indefinitely. Several weeks after his first meeting with Steiger, Johannes was approached by a different visitor, a constable whom he recognized from the Goldener Adler, a man named Sergeant Volker, who had previously seemed to be sympathetic to workers' concerns and who had occasionally shared information about police activities with the beer hall regulars. Volker made contact with him at the newspaper office, requesting a brief conversation in a location away from the building. They met in a small park, not far from the Danube, and Volker, speaking with a kind of urgent carefulness, provided information that seemed designed to alter Johannes's assessment of the situation in which he was becoming entangled. Volker explained that there was, apparently, interest in certain circles within the police and the city administration regarding the pattern of disappearances that Steiger was investigating. The interest was not purely investigative in nature. Rather, there seemed to be factions within the apparatus of power, some individuals who wished the matter to remain suppressed, and others who believed that reopening certain cases might serve their interests in factional struggles within the administration. Volker did not identify which faction he served, but he made clear that he believed some information regarding the matter could be productively shared with a trusted journalist. However, this sharing would need to occur carefully, and it would depend significantly on the discretion and intelligence of the individuals involved. Krauss, Volker indicated, was indeed the central figure in the pattern, though the network of protection and suppression that had kept the matter hidden extended far beyond a single individual. This conversation with Volker seemed to confirm that something larger than Johannes's private concern had begun to move. The detective story that had seemed to be his alone to carry, a private matter of conscience regarding an individual woman whose disappearance had been rendered invisible, was apparently becoming something more public, more institutional, more potentially consequential. Yet this larger movement was itself murky and contingent. It depended on internal struggles within Vienna's administrative apparatus, on the willingness of certain officials to expose matters that would also implicate some of their colleagues, on the capacity of a young journalist to navigate between competing interests while maintaining his own integrity. Over the following months, a strange negotiation developed involving Johannes, Steiger, Volker, and various other individuals whose exact roles and motivations remained somewhat unclear. Steiger continued his research, developing his story through interviews with families of missing women and through careful analysis of police records and other documentary evidence. Johannes provided what information he could, drawing on his years of observation and his particular knowledge of Greta's disappearance. He also facilitated introductions between Steiger and other workers and residents who had information to share, using the networks of connection that had developed through his years of attendance at the Goldener Adler and his status as someone who seemed genuinely interested in truth rather than exploitation. Volker and other sympathetic police officials provided guidance regarding what information might be pursued and what remained too dangerous to investigate too directly. Yet even as this investigation proceeded, Johannes remained acutely aware of the dangers inherent in his participation. Inspector Steinhauer, whom he had encountered years earlier, remained active in the police force. There were other officials, whom he did not know by name, but whose interests seemed aligned with maintaining the suppression of the matter. He had been warned years previously what the consequences of continued inquiry might be. He was now knowingly accepting those risks, and this acceptance seemed to constitute a kind of transformation in himself, a movement from protective caution toward a form of participation that acknowledged its own peril, while choosing to proceed nonetheless. The internal factionalism that Volker had referenced became increasingly apparent as Steiger's investigation progressed. There were moments when it seemed that the story might be suppressed before it could be published, when individuals who benefited from continued silence seemed to be mobilizing institutional resources to prevent its emergence. Yet there were also moments when it seemed that the story might gain traction, when certain officials appeared willing to allow the investigation to proceed, when the possibility of disrupting the existing suppression seemed briefly achievable. Johannes observed this struggle from his position as a compositor and informal participant in the investigation, remaining largely invisible to the broader public while understanding more about the forces shaping events than most people who read the newspapers. By the latter part of 1894, nearly 6 years after Greta's initial disappearance, the situation had reached a kind of critical juncture. Steiger's article was substantially completed and awaited publication. Johannes had provided what assistance he could without destroying his own capacity to maintain employment and shelter. The question of whether the story would actually reach the public and what consequences would follow if it did remained deeply uncertain. What seemed clear was that Johannes had, through a gradual process of incremental choices, moved from the position of a man maintaining protective silence to that of someone who had become actively involved in an attempt to force truth into visibility. This involvement had not been heroic or glorious. It had emerged through a combination of weariness, conscience, and the accident of encountering a journalist whose determination had seemed, in the end, too significant to be dismissed. And now, having committed himself to this course, Johannes found himself waiting to discover what consequences would follow. The article appeared on a Tuesday morning in early December of 1894, occupying a substantial portion of the front page of the Wiener Zeitung, beneath a headline that read, "Missing Women. A Pattern Emerges." Johannes learned of its publication in the same manner as the rest of Vienna's reading public learned of it, by observing the morning delivery of newspapers to the printing floor, though he possessed the particular knowledge that came from having participated, however marginally, in bringing it into existence. The article was authored by Wilhelm Steiger, under the byline of a pseudonym, a precaution that seemed designed to provide some minimal layer of protection against direct retaliation. Yet the substantive content made clear the identity of the individuals and institutions implicated in the pattern being described. The article presented, with careful documentation and restraint, the cases of 7 women who had disappeared from Vienna over the past 6 years. It identified patterns in their disappearances. All had been young women of working-class origins. All had disappeared without clear explanation. All had apparently been connected in some fashion to a particular individual. Herr Dr. Friedrich Krauss, an administrator in the city government. The article did not make explicit accusations of criminal activity, a caution that seemed designed to provide legal protection against libel charges while still making the essential facts available to readers. Instead, it documented the pattern, raised questions regarding why the police investigations into these disappearances had apparently been perfunctory, and suggested that powerful individuals might have an interest in preventing thorough investigation of the matter. The publication of the article produced immediate consequences. Police activity increased visibly. Officers appeared at various locations throughout Vienna, conducting interviews and investigations. The newspaper office itself received official visits from individuals representing various governmental departments. Herr Richter, the editor and proprietor of the Wiener Zeitung, entered into what appeared to be serious discussions with institutional authorities regarding the circumstances of the article's publication. There was a particular tension in the atmosphere, a sense that significant forces were in motion and that consequences of various kinds were being negotiated between different actors whose exact positions and motivations remained somewhat obscure to ordinary observers. Johannes, working at his compositor's table, with the particular attention he maintained toward all institutional developments, observed these consequences with a mixture of apprehension and a kind of grim satisfaction. The article had been published. The pattern had been made visible in print. Whatever happened subsequently, whether the authorities moved to investigate seriously or whether they moved to suppress further inquiry, the basic facts had now entered the public record. This seemed significant to him, though he remained aware that significance in the realm of truth and justice did not necessarily translate into practical consequences or institutional change. Over the following weeks, a complex process of negotiation and maneuvering occurred that was only partially visible to Johannes through the information that leaked into the newspaper office and the broader networks of Vienna's gossip. The authorities, it seemed, could not entirely suppress the article or prevent discussion of its contents without suggesting that something criminal had indeed occurred and was being concealed. Yet they also possessed substantial interest in preventing the matter from expanding into a major scandal that would undermine public confidence in the city's governance. A compromise of sorts seemed to emerge. Certain officials would be questioned. An investigation of sorts would be conducted, but the inquiry would be managed in ways that would prevent it from extending too deeply into the networks of power and protection that had apparently sustained the pattern. Herr Dr. Kraus, the individual at the center of Steiger's article, was indeed questioned by police. Yet the questioning appeared to be conducted in a manner designed to reach conclusions that would be acceptable to various parties invested in managing the situation. The official narrative that began to emerge suggested that Kraus had engaged in inappropriate relationships with young women of working-class origins, a matter that was deplorable from a moral perspective, but that did not constitute a criminal offense under Vienna's legal codes. The disappearances themselves, it was suggested, had resulted from the women voluntarily departing Vienna after their relationships with Kraus had ended, presumably out of shame or desire to escape situations that had become uncomfortable. One of the women, a case that had been particularly difficult for authorities to explain away, had apparently died by suicide, though the circumstances of her death remained somewhat ambiguous in the official accounts. The resolution, such as it was, proved deeply unsatisfying. No serious criminal charges were filed. Kraus was not arrested or prosecuted. The administrative inquiry that was conducted resulted in a recommendation that he be reassigned to a different department, a consequence that seemed designed to remove him from the immediate context where the pattern had occurred without imposing any serious punishment. The message seemed clear. He had been engaged in conduct that was inappropriate and exploitative, but not in conduct that Vienna's institutional authorities deemed worthy of criminal prosecution. The women who had disappeared, or more precisely, the family members who had somehow survived them, received no particular acknowledgement or compensation. The matter was, officially, concluded. Yet something had shifted in the interim. The pattern had been documented in print. Steiger's article had circulated through Vienna, had been discussed in cafes and beer halls and workplaces, had entered into the collective memory as a matter that had been publicly acknowledged, however much the official response had been inadequate. Families of the missing women who had previously maintained silence out of shame or fear had been provided with a kind of public validation. Their losses had been recognized as part of a systematic pattern, rather than as isolated incidents reflecting on the character or judgment of individual women. Other young women in Vienna's working-class districts had gained awareness of the mechanisms through which exploitation could operate, knowledge that might translate into protective caution in their own circumstances. Beyond these limited but meaningful consequences, the matter had also produced a subtle alteration in Vienna's institutional landscape. The factions within the city administration that Volcker had referenced had apparently succeeded in their objective of using the scandal to increase their own power at the expense of rivals. Certain individuals who had been compromised by their association with Krauss had suffered in their careers. Other individuals had benefited from their apparent willingness to permit investigation to proceed to a certain point. The fundamental structures of corruption and exploitation had not been dismantled, but the lines of alliance and opposition within those structures had shifted slightly. This was not justice precisely, but it was something. A minor adjustment in the distribution of power, a modest consequence extracted from an elaborate system of concealment. In the months following the publication of Steiger's article, Johannes observed various developments that seemed to flow from the disruption that had been created. Inspector Steinhauer, the official who had detained him years earlier and who had seemed to represent the forces interested in maintaining suppression, appeared to have lost influence. He was reassigned to a different district, a consequence that suggested he was being marginalized by his superiors. Volcker, the sympathetic sergeant who had provided information to Steiger, was promoted, a development that seemed to reward his participation in the process. The factions and alliances that underlay Vienna's apparent order revealed themselves through these personnel movements as being considerably more fluid than they appeared to be to ordinary observers. Yet these institutional developments, while significant in their way, seemed almost secondary to the personal consequences that began to manifest in Johannes's own life. His participation in Steiger's investigation, which had remained largely invisible to the public, did not remain invisible to those in positions of power who valued knowing who had done what in the production of the article. He was regarded with a kind of suspicion by certain individuals in the newspaper office, though this suspicion did not translate into direct confrontation or overt punishment. Rather, it manifested in a kind of subtle marginalization. He was given less desirable work assignments. His opinions regarding printing decisions were solicited less frequently. Younger compositors were promoted or provided with better opportunities, while his own advancement remained stalled. The message was communicated clearly enough. He was marked as someone who had participated in disrupting the normal functioning of institutional power. And while his participation was not sufficiently significant to warrant serious retaliation, it was sufficient to mark him as a person of questionable loyalty. More substantially, Johannes's identity as someone who had been involved in the investigation became known to a broader circle of people than he would have preferred. Workers at the beer hall, who had heard rumors through various channels, began to regard him with a kind of respect mixed with caution. Friedrich, the carpenter-philosopher whose conversations had meant much to him over the years, took him aside one evening and spoke with a kind of pride regarding his participation in the effort to force truth into visibility. "You have done something," Friedrich said, "that most people find themselves unable to do. You have risked something, not your life perhaps, but your comfort and your security, in order to accomplish something that seemed to you to be right. This is rare. Most people are too afraid, and their fear is understandable given the power that authority can deploy against them. But you chose differently. Yet this respect and recognition seemed to carry its own burdens. Johannes became, in the eyes of others, a person who had stood against power and who had succeeded, at least partially, in forcing consequences. This identity brought with it expectations that he was not always comfortable meeting. People began to approach him with other grievances, other instances of injustice that they believed he might be willing to investigate or to publicize. He became, in effect, a kind of symbol of the possibility of resistance, a living suggestion that power could be opposed and that those who opposed it might somehow triumph. The burden of this symbolic status was considerably more substantial than Johannes found entirely bearable. He was, after all, still a compositor with limited resources and limited capacity to address the manifold injustices that Vienna contained. One particular consequence of the article's publication was deeply personal and seemed to affect him more profoundly than the broader institutional developments. Greta's aunt, with whom he had had minimal contact over the years, sought him out several months after the article appeared. She requested a meeting, and they encountered each other in a quiet location near the river. The aunt, who was perhaps 60 years of age and who carried the visible marks of having endured considerable hardship, spoke to him with a directness that seemed to have been enabled by the publicity surrounding the matter. She had confirmed, through the investigation that had followed Steiger's article, that Greta was dead. Not a suicide, as some had suggested, but rather a victim of circumstances that had resulted in her death. The exact details remained unclear, but it seemed that she had been with Krauss when some kind of accident or violent incident had occurred. Rather than reporting the death and explaining the circumstances, the institutional forces aligned with Krauss had simply ensured that Greta's remains disappeared and that her absence became invisible. The aunt's confirmation of what Johannes had in some sense always known produced in him a particular kind of grief that seemed different from the grief he had carried over the preceding 6 years. It was grief not merely for Greta herself, but for the mechanisms through which her death had been concealed, for the families who had been forced to live with inexplicable absence rather than the closure that acknowledgement might have provided, for the fundamental contempt toward working-class lives that the pattern had revealed. Yet it was also, in some strange way, a kind of relief, the confirmation that what he had suspected was true, that his instincts regarding the matter had not been misguided, that the investigation and the article had not been based on false premises or misinterpretation. Greta had not run away. She had not voluntarily left Vienna. She had died, and those responsible for her death had deployed institutional power to obscure that death and to render it invisible. This confirmation seemed to bring closure of a sort to the investigation that had consumed so much of his consciousness over the preceding 6 years. The central mystery, what had become of Greta, why she had disappeared, had been at least partially resolved. The resolution was not satisfying in the sense of producing justice or punishment proportionate to the crime. Krauss remained alive and employed, merely reassigned to a different position within the city administration. The broader network of protection that had concealed the matter had not been dismantled, but merely partially adjusted. Yet something had been accomplished. Greta's existence and her death had been publicly acknowledged. The pattern that had claimed her and others had been documented and made visible. These accomplishments seemed modest, almost insignificant when weighed against the scale of the injustice that had occurred, yet they seemed to Johannes to constitute the only form of justice that was realistically achievable within Vienna's existing structures of power.
By the end of 1895, approximately 1 year after Steiger's article had appeared, Vienna had moved on to other concerns and scandals, as cities inevitably do. The question of missing women, which had briefly occupied newspaper columns and generated public discussion, faded into the background as new events and controversies claimed attention. Krauss remained in his position, diminished in status but not seriously harmed. Steiger, who had proven himself to be a capable journalist through his investigation, moved on to other stories and had already begun to establish a reputation that would allow him to pursue more prominent positions at larger publications. The members of Vienna's institutional apparatus, who had benefited from the disruption, consolidated their gains and moved forward with their various projects. And Johannes Keller, compositor and reluctant witness, returned to his labor at the newspaper office, aware that something significant had occurred, but uncertain whether it would produce consequences substantial enough to justify the disruptions it had generated in his own life. The autumn of 1899 arrived in Vienna with the particular quality of light that the city possessed during the final months of the year, a clarity that seemed to strip away pretense and illusion, rendering visible both the grandeur of the imperial architecture and the decay that lurked in the interstices between the monumental buildings. Johannes Keller, now 38 years old, observed this light from his compositor's table as it filtered through the tall windows of the printing floor, illuminating dust particles that seemed to move with deliberate slowness through the humid air. He had spent more than a quarter-century in this space, and the familiarity it held for him had evolved beyond mere habituation into something approaching affection. The particular smell of ink and machine oil, the weight of type in his hand, the precise mechanics of arranging letters into words and words into lines, these elements of his daily labor had become as intimate to him as the rhythms of his own breathing. The Wiener Zeitung continued to be produced with the reliable consistency that had characterized its operations for decades. The presses had been updated once more during the preceding years, incorporating innovations that increased production capacity, but that did not fundamentally alter the skilled labor that remained essential to the composition process. Johannes had mentored several younger men into competence, transmitting the craft he had learned from Herr Schoenfeld and had refined through years of practice. The oldest of these apprentices, a boy named Thomas, who had arrived at the shop some 7 years previously, had developed into a compositor of genuine skill and promise. Johannes found satisfaction in this transmission of knowledge, in the recognition that his expertise, though undervalued and inadequately compensated, would persist beyond himself through the bodies and hands of those he had taught. The city that surrounded the print shop had continued its transformation with relentless momentum. The electric trams had become ubiquitous, their wires creating an elaborate geometric pattern across Vienna's sky. Electric lighting had expanded into progressively more districts, rendering the old gas lamps increasingly obsolete. The Vienna that Johannes had known in his youth, the city of gas lamps and horse-drawn carriages and relatively intimate neighborhoods, existed now primarily in memory and in the occasional pocket of the city that had not yet been subject to modernization. Yet, something in this transformation seemed to have slowed or plateaued during the final years of the 1890s. The boundless optimism that had characterized Vienna during the earlier decades had been tempered by economic concerns and by the growing recognition that the Austro-Hungarian Empire was experiencing various kinds of institutional strain.
The matter of Greta's disappearance, which had occupied so much of Johannes's consciousness over the preceding decade, had become something different over time. It was no longer a mystery demanding solution, but rather a kind of permanent scar in his understanding of how the world functioned. He thought of her occasionally, particularly when he encountered young women working in the newspaper office or on the streets of Vienna. He thought of her family, particularly the aunt who had sought him out to confirm the basic facts of Greta's death and who had subsequently faded from his awareness.
He thought of the pattern itself, the systematic vulnerability of young women of working-class origins to exploitation by men positioned within institutional power structures. These thoughts no longer produced the acute disturbance they had generated years earlier. But they had not disappeared entirely. They had instead settled into the deeper strata of his consciousness, informing his observations and his judgments, without demanding constant attention. The publication of Steiger's article, which had seemed at the time to represent a significant disruption in the normal functioning of Vienna's institutions, had revealed itself over subsequent years to have produced more limited consequences than Johannes had sometimes hoped or feared. The scandal had faded from public consciousness, displaced by other scandals and other matters of concern. Kraus had eventually been removed entirely from his administrative position. But this removal had occurred gradually, and without the public attention that might have ensured accountability. He had apparently emigrated to another part of the empire, where he had taken up a position in a provincial administration, removing himself from Vienna without the necessity of prosecution or legal judgment. The broader pattern of institutional corruption and the exploitation of vulnerable women had continued, though with perhaps somewhat greater caution and discretion than had been evident previously. Yet something had shifted in Johannes's understanding of what such limited consequences represented. In his younger years, he might have regarded the inadequacy of the response as a failure, as evidence that his participation in the investigation and his complicity in the publication of Steiger's article had been ultimately ineffectual. But the passage of years and the accumulation of experience had produced in him a different perspective. He had come to understand that in a world ordered according to hierarchies of power, that individuals like himself could not fundamentally reshape. The achievement of even limited consequences, the acknowledgement of truth, the modification of behavior through the threat of exposure, the minor adjustment of institutional arrangements constituted a form of success that was realistically attainable. The recognition that complete justice was impossible did not invalidate the significance of partial justice or of the disruption of comfortable ignorance. In the years following the scandal, Johannes had gradually become something of an informal elder within the community of workers and residents who inhabited the neighborhoods surrounding the newspaper office. He was regarded as someone who possessed both practical wisdom regarding the functioning of institutions and a kind of moral seriousness that seemed to flow from his lived experience of confronting power. People occasionally approached him with their own difficulties. A worker seeking assistance in understanding legal documents, a family trying to navigate the bureaucratic processes required to secure official permits or approvals, individuals seeking guidance regarding how to respond to injustices they had encountered. His responses were always practical and grounded in his understanding of how institutions actually functioned rather than how they theoretically should function. He rarely urged people toward resistance or confrontation, recognizing from his own experience that such actions carried real costs. Rather, he offered assistance in working within and around the systems that constrained people's possibilities.
One of the ways in which this informal role had manifested was through his increasing involvement with a small charitable organization affiliated with the Karmeliterkirche, the chapel where he had sought refuge during his years of greatest internal disturbance. Father Matthias, with whom he had developed a kind of deep friendship over the preceding decade, had suggested that Johannes might apply his skills to assisting working people with documentation and correspondence, writing letters of appeal to various bureaucratic authorities, helping people to understand the precise language required to navigate official processes, assisting in the preparation of documents that might improve individuals' possibilities for securing employment or housing or other forms of assistance. This work had begun modestly but had gradually expanded, consuming an increasing portion of his leisure time. He found it profoundly satisfying in a way that his compositional labor, however skilled and precise, did not provide. It offered direct evidence of consequence. A letter he had written might result in a family securing housing. A carefully composed appeal might result in an official reconsidering a denial of assistance. The question of romantic attachment, which had haunted him in his youth, had gradually transformed into something less acute, though not entirely absent. He had come to accept, over the years, that the circumstances of his life, his modest income, his lack of property, his existence at the margins of Vienna's economic hierarchy, rendered marriage and family essentially impossible for him. This acceptance had been painful in his 30s, when the finality of this impossibility had first become clear. But by his late 30s, the pain had diminished, replaced by a kind of resigned peace. He had developed a life that, while lacking in certain forms of intimacy and companionship, possessed its own satisfactions. He had work that engaged his skills. He had friendships, particularly with Friedrich, who had remained a constant presence at the Goldener Adler, and with Father Matthias, whose wisdom and quiet acceptance of human complexity had provided him with a kind of spiritual companionship that did not depend on religious conviction. He had the small apartment that had become familiar and comfortable over the years. He had books and the capacity to read, which provided him with access to ideas and worlds that transcended the immediate constraints of his circumstances. The young apprentice Thomas, whom he had mentored for 7 years, had begun to develop ambitions that extended beyond the compositor's trade. The boy, now in his early 20s, possessed both skill and intelligence, and he had begun to suggest that he might seek employment with one of Vienna's publishing houses in a capacity that might involve editorial work, or at least compositional work of a more intellectually engaging nature than the routine production of the newspaper. Johannes encouraged this ambition, recognizing in Thomas something of the restless intelligence that had characterized his own youth. He offered practical guidance regarding how one might approach such opportunities, drawing on his own decades of observing Vienna's professional hierarchies and the mechanisms through which advancement could sometimes be achieved. In late autumn of 1899, as Vienna prepared for the transition into a new century, Johannes found himself in a contemplative frame of mind that seemed appropriate to the historical moment. The 19th century was ending, and the 20th century was about to begin, and this transition seemed to carry symbolic weight that everyone felt, though few could precisely articulate. There had been considerable discussion in the newspapers regarding what the new century might bring. Some writers predicted unprecedented progress and improvement. Others warned of dangers and disruptions. The atmosphere of Vienna itself seemed to shift with the approach of the century's end, as if the city itself was preparing to transform into something different, though what that transformation might entail remained unknowable. On an evening in early December, walking home from the Goldener Adler after his regular Saturday gathering with Friedrich and other workers, Johannes found himself reflecting on the particular arc that his life had taken. He had begun as an orphaned boy of 12, entering into apprenticeship as a kind of last resort when no other options presented themselves. He had become a skilled compositor, a trade that had sustained him economically and intellectually over the course of decades. He had encountered mystery and injustice, and he had, in his own limited way, participated in efforts to force those realities into visibility. He had aged, and his youth's particular hungers had gradually been replaced by different satisfactions and different forms of meaning. He had not achieved material prosperity or social standing. He had not married or established a family. He had not become famous or influential. Yet he had lived a life that seemed to him, increasingly, to contain integrity and meaning, despite its modest circumstances and limited reach. The streets of Vienna in the gaslight, for the electric lighting had not entirely replaced the older technology, seemed to glow with a kind of melancholy beauty as he walked through them. He passed the building where he had first worked under Herr Schoenfeld's instruction, now occupied by a different business. He passed the neighborhood where Greta had lived with her aunt, an area he rarely visited, but which remained part of the geography of his consciousness. He passed the police station where he had been detained years earlier, an experience that had altered his understanding of his own vulnerability within institutions of power. He passed the Karmeliterkirche, where Father Matthias would likely be concluding evening prayers, offering spiritual comfort to whatever handful of the faithful had gathered. The city seemed to contain within its physical space the accumulated experience of his own life, places marked by particular moments of significance, streets that carried the weight of memory and meaning. As he entered his small apartment and lit the lamp that provided illumination, Johannes was aware of a particular sense of peace that seemed to flow from the recognition that his life, though it had not followed any trajectory that he would have consciously chosen or predicted, had contained dignity and meaning. He had done work that required skill and precision. He had participated, however modestly, in efforts to challenge injustice. He had formed connections with others that had enriched his existence. He had read widely and thought carefully about the world and his place within it. He had failed to accomplish many things he had once hoped to achieve, and this recognition no longer produced in him the acute sense of loss it once had. Instead, it produced something closer to acceptance, the understanding that human life operated according to constraints that individuals could observe and comprehend, but could not entirely transcend. He settled into his chair with a book, a new work by a Viennese author that had been recommended to him. And in this simple act of reading by lamplight in his sparse apartment, Johannes Keller seemed to embody something essential about the possibility of maintaining inner richness in circumstances of material modesty. The city outside his windows continued its peculiar transformation. The century prepared to yield to its successor, and the mechanisms of institutional power continued to operate according to their own logic, indifferent to individual human lives played out within their fields of operation. Yet within his small space, illuminated by lamplight and furnished with books and consciousness, a man had constructed a form of dignity that did not depend on external validation or institutional recognition. It was a dignity rooted in the quality of his attention to the world. in his refusal to accept comfortable lies, in his persistence in seeking truth even when truth could not be acted upon, in his capacity to offer quiet assistance to others while maintaining clear-eyed recognition of the limitations of such assistance. As the 20th century approached, carrying with it whatever transformations and upheavals it would bring, Johannes Keller moved through Vienna's streets and through his daily labor with the particular peace that comes from having accepted both the world's fundamental injustice and one's own modest capacity to bear witness to that injustice with integrity and care.